Let me just say that Risa has curated a lot of terrific exhibitions, written for many arts publications. She has 2 master's degrees, one from Bard and another from Hunter, and she's now a doctoral candidate in Northwestern University's art history program. Risa, it's my pleasure to turn it to you and say about the piece.
Hi, everybody. So I think last week, no, 2 weeks ago, I was supposed to give this talk in person. I'm going to share my screen before I forget. Yes. Okay. Is that working? Mm-hmm. We're gonna have me and Allison and Mark on the side. So 2 weeks ago, I was supposed to give this talk in person. And at that time, Walls Turn Sideways, Artists Confront the Justice System was still open at Tufts University Art Gallery. But among the many changes that we've all experienced in the recent weeks, the show has now been closed, as has the university. This was an exhibition that I made over the course of 5 years, beginning in 2012. And there was a sort of number of confluences in my professional and personal life that pointed me to the topic of the justice system. If you remember 2012, we were all becoming much more aware at that point of a sort of epidemic of police officer involved shootings around deaths of Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown, and Ferguson. And in my own personal life, I had a very close family member begin the process that would lead to an incarceration and 20-year sentence in Texas. Not a great place to be in prison. And this was happening at the same time that I was going to Chicago a lot. And I'm actually talking from Chicago right now, where I was meeting a group of artists who were doing incredible things under the sort of pretenses of social practice. Among those things, I was meeting artists who were closing supermax prisons. I was meeting artists who were getting reparations and formal public apologies from the city of Chicago for 2 decades worth of police brutality that had been systematically hidden from the public. And in my own sort of personal life, I wanted to talk to these artists. I wanted to know exactly how they went about, like, first of all, why they thought that an artistic project would be the sort of right avenue for thinking about closing a prison. And then second, how they were successful in that. They were the people that I wanted to talk to. And then third area of my life, I'm an art historian in my day job. And my research at the time was taking me to the history of collecting. I was thinking a lot about the 16th century and these sort of early moments when Columbus and Cortez were coming back to the King of Spain with examples of people from the New World. And those people would often spend the rest of their lives in the palace. And I began to think about like the ways in which collection can sort of has a relationship to capture and vice versa. So like along with all sorts of loot and objects that still exist in museums today, people were amongst those sort of like curious objects. And so it began a sort of project for me for thinking about the ways that the museum and the prison were linked together and needed to be thought together. I thought about this, this was a really important part of the project for me, because in thinking about the ways that, I mean, I think even more so than in 2012, the ways in which the museums are kind of exploiting justice-themed programming as a sort of pat on the back, we did justice, look at PS1's new show, as a way to kind of veil the sort of crimes and misdemeanors of their board members, I really thought that for me to do an exhibition about justice within the museum needed to start by thinking about the ways in which the museum was implicated in questions of justice to begin with. So I'm going to start showing y'all some images, and hopefully some of these relationships will come out. Okay, what do I do? So, walls turn sideways. I wanted to call it the carceral state, so that's like a throwback. It's artists confront the justice system, because carceral state was a little too much for the cam. But the show takes images and objects which use social justice as a subject. It includes artworks that analyze the prison industrial complex as a structure through institutional critique, and it aims to change the legislature as part of a social practice. And there are some basic core questions. So, what is the social role and responsibility of the artist, the curator, and the museum in times of political urgency? We could almost say that that question has been amplified recently. What functions can only art and artists fulfill in the social and political landscape? This was something that I found to be really important when I was looking across the country for artists and artworks. I wanted not the perspective of lawyers, like yet again, I wanted to look at those artists like Tam's Tenure, like Chicago Torture Justice, who were thinking like artists. And because they were thinking like artists, they weren't thinking like legislators or lawyers or activists, or they were thinking alongside of those people, but using the tools of art to see like what kind of actual efficacy art could have. And then how can we look at the prison system museologically as a collection of people, and how can that sort of reframing of it help in an abolitionist project? And lastly, what kind of role does visuality play in punishment systems? So I should pause right now to say that the title of the show, Walls Turn Sideways, is a partial quote of a Angela Davis quotation from her autobiography. And the full quote is, "Walls turn sideways are bridges." And that will become a sort of key component in the organization of the show. I realized at a certain point in making the show that we stopped using the term prison industrial complex at a certain point, and we began using the term mass incarceration. I have a feeling that it's circa the time of Michelle Alexander and her book, The New Jim Crow. And as I began thinking and researching and talking to more and more people, I realized that those two terms aren't interchangeable at all, that the prison industrial complex is speaking to the structure, and then mass incarceration is speaking to the people that live inside that structure and how they're deeply sort of entangled. So the first part of the show, I actually use a figure ground metaphor to kind of make this apparent. So the first part of the show is called Ground, and it's about the prison industrial complex and sort of laying the ground upon which the problem of mass incarceration sits. And the second part of the show is called Figure. In talking to artists across the country, I realized that I could basically construct a moving portrait of the moment from which somebody is racially profiled to the moment of arrest, to when they move into the justice system via the court, into the prison itself, and then the possibilities that appear for leaving that system. So in thinking about this relationship between figure and ground, prison industrial complex, mass incarceration, I realized that I was kind of negotiating these kind of binary terms. And what Angela Davis really helped me think myself out of that by thinking about this bridge as a sort of tertiary that helps us hopefully move what seems like a deadlock. So I'm going to go through each of the sections of the show from the beginning. So, I read this huge book, and I'm going to try to talk about this now. So part of the project was to think about the relationship of the museum to the prison. And I realized at the time it wasn't only the museum, but it was this whole sort of host of institutions that are government maintained, state operated, that are a way that a nation state administers to its citizens. I should also tell you that for other people to introduce, like to enter into this sort of conversation about mass incarceration, would begin with Michelle Alexander. For me, I went back to the start, which was Foucault's Discipline and Punish. And I began not only by thinking about Discipline and Punish, but thinking about his entire sort of catalog and how if you line up all of his books, what you see is this sort of systematic interrogation of different institutions. So beginning with the asylum, then he thinks about the hospital, and then he thinks about the prison, then he sort of takes a break, and then he thinks, kind of comes back and thinks through sexuality. And I had kind of wondered if his life hadn't been cut short, would he have ever gotten to the prison? And that's where I sort of tried to pick up. There are other people that have tried to pick up there too. And now those people, I'll talk about Tony Bennett in a minute. But for me, in thinking about the ways in which sorts of how all institutions functioned, I realized there was sort of these systematic sort of roles. So to begin with capture, I began to think about the zoo and also the history of the zoo and its relationship to the panopticon. So actually the panopticon is rumored to be based on a sort of viewing station that Louis XVI had built in his palace at Versailles, in which he sat at the center of an all glass room and then could see all of these sort of animals that were out in his menagerie, sort of, but they didn't know he was there. And over time, Bentham would pick that up for the panopticon. When I thought about capture and the moment one enters into the prison, I thought about certain surveillance tactics and that are being implemented on the border most of the time. And it brought us directly into the conversation around detention centers. So this part of the exhibition is represented in the show and in the book by work by Post Commodity, and specifically work in which they are thinking about how Mexican American Border Patrol agents on the US-Mexico border are employing aspects of their culture to lure Mexican people into, they're kind of like acting as decoys and like on very hunting-based models. Within the space of the exhibition, Jenny Pollock was commissioned to think about, she made for Tufts and also for the Contemporary Art Museum in Houston, these floor plans from which it showed how visitors could escape the museum without using the front door in case of an ICE raid. Other modes of thinking about capture came in the show via Zach Blass, who's thinking about historical forms of capture. So these are based on 18th, 19th century sort of face cages, which were often used as sort of punishment specifically for women so that they could go around doing their usual sort of day-to-day work while also having sort of spectacle around their body and being limited in other ways. But Zach is also connecting these longer histories of punishment to contemporary biometric facial scanning recognition. So you'll see on the left is the facial scan of this woman's face. She's also an artist. And then he took that facial scan and actually made it into a 3D printed object, which she then wore as a mask in an endurance performance. He and 3 other artists also went through this process. So Zach is an artist who's American but based in London and is often thinking about the sort of biometric capture and the ways in which technology sort of does the work of hunting us for us. Moving on from capture, I began to think about the ways in which once you have a body, once you have a person and you bring them into the institution, what the next step would be. And following Coco Fusco and Guillermo Gomez Pena were actually really important for this exhibition and the work that they did around Couple in a Cage. Coco wrote a really important essay that's like a sort of written companion to this and this performance. And in that essay, she kind of lists this history of capture of othered people or marginalized people, and they're being put on display in public arenas, but also the capture of prisoners through the 18th century. And so this sort of ambiguous space between like zoo animal, but also museum object, and then also like in prison subject became this sort of tenuous kind of gray area that I wanted the exhibition to live in. So in the sort of formula, moving through the sort of Foucauldian apparatus, you bring a body into an institution, you put it on display. And I think what's important, theorists like Tony Bennett would say that it's through the display of othered bodies that the viewing public begins to consolidate around a sort of hegemonic identity and can establish themselves as an us and as an opposition to a you or a they that is in the prison. So Tony Bennett is also an important thinker for the show, and he has a theory of a relationship between museums and prisons that I began to see also play out in the work of artists like Ashley Hunt. So to tell you about the project, Ashley is based in LA. He teaches at Cal Arts. He was actually trained in Chicago, and I think that's one of the subtexts of the show, is that they're the sort of communities of social practice that are coming out of Chicago and their sort of networks outward, but certainly by no means like the text of the show. So Tony Bennett's theory is that at a certain point, the spectacle of punishment, the sort of gallows, the women in face cages, etc., public hangings, guillotines, becomes out of favor. And punishment becomes increasingly more distant from the landscape at the same time that museums rise to kind of take over that role of public spectacle. So this is like circa 1850. Ashley Hunt traveled to every prison in the continental United States and took a picture from the nearest public road. So here you can see that way off in the sort of horizon line of this picture, you see a very faint prison. And all of the photographs in this series are replicate these circumstances. They're usually prisons that are far away from the highway, like a sort of major highway, and then you take a exit down a country road, and then you go down in 3 more country roads until you're faced with a sort of high security fence, and within that, like many miles away, the actual prison. So Ashley's project, Degrees of Visibility, is in fact trying to illustrate the ways in which the prison has become invisible from the landscape in the same way that Tony Bennett's theory sort of charts. And then I'll show you this is a shot from the show at Tufts. The show actually started this way, which I thought was such a great install on their part. And you'll see here this color photograph is actually a work by Trevor Paglin. And it is the light pollution given off by San Quentin prison. So you can't physically access San Quentin and you can't see it in the actual landscape, but at night it gives so much light pollution off that you can see its sort of presence through its invisibility, or like the sort of effects of it. So I thought this was an amazing way to start the show off at Tufts by thinking about how we don't see the prison, and then you kind of traverse this wall and see the rest of the exhibition. So thank you, Abby, to a really great install there at Tufts. So I'm just going to keep reiterating the sort of equation. You bring somebody into an institution, you put them on display, and then you have to figure out what they are. So this is where like Foucault's theories from birth, what is it called? The one about the hospital. There's one about the hospital. And thinking about sort of psychiatric and medical evaluation practice. So Mary Patton is also an artist based here in Chicago. She teaches at the ESAIC. She is formerly incarcerated, and this is a piece called Panel, in which she restaged a very historic conference discussion that featured Foucault, Harvey Harp, and a series, Judith Clark, and Ronald Lang. So all of these anti-psychiatry activists who in the mid-70s were deeply involved in conversations with abolitionists. So this is an restaging of this historic conversation that gets to the sort of link between prisons and asylums and hospitals. And at the time, especially, prisoners were often being used as sort of human test subjects for a lot of psychological torture. And hence all of these sort of people trying to get together to unthink this problem. Another person who's interested in the question of like evaluation is Kapwani Kawanga, who's actually a Canadian artist who lives in Paris. And this was an incredibly beautiful, abstract, moving portrait of color. Each of these colors that you see, so first we have ripple in white, and there's a cutout here in this white wall that frames the wall behind it as if it were a painting. So in the early teens, it was believed that this sort of spinach green and this buff sky color were the best colors for painting hospital walls. And that is because the green is the opposite of red. And it was thought that like doctors would be able to better like attenuate their eyes to like open bodies in the colors of blood. And then so ripple in white is paired with Baker Miller pink, which was a pink that was designed because it was supposedly like soothing to prisoned and detained people. So this is a study of like institutional colors and their relationships to each other. I think it's also really interesting that if you go back to like the Le Corbusier sort of treatises, when he's talking about ripple in white, he talks about like how you need white to offset anything that would like sort of cause disorder, that against white, everything, like all disorder shows itself. And his writings really echo a lot of the kind of rhetoric that's happening in French colonial prisons, where, for instance, colonial prisoners were asked to wear, I don't remember if they were chalked on their clothes or if the walls were chalked, but if that meant if anytime they would lean on something, they would also like leave a mark on their body to show that they had been idle. So the ways in which paint color and walls and bodies were already implicated in the sort of disciplinary function at the time that Le Corbusier is thinking about how white walls are the ideal situation for modern museums. So just to track where we are, we have our body, we've brought it in, we're looking at it, we're figuring out what it is. And then the next step would be to classify it, which is a moment in which the library becomes implicated. And I think that the library presents itself as like super benign. And yet I think Titus Kafar's Jerome project kinds of shows the ways in which classification already has like a sort of subtext behind it. So this is a sort of later version of a multi-year project that the New Haven artist Titus Kafar has been engaged with. And it began when the artist went online to look up his father's record, and he realized that there were 99 other men who shared his father's name in the system. And so this project has taken many forms. This is a chalk and asphalt version, which I think also ties really nicely to Kapwani's work right before it. And here you have multiple layers of the mugshots of these men as they're made available online, kind of stacked on top of each other. Kafara also has a project called the Destiny Project, which was represented in the catalog for the show. And it's thinking along the same lines, like, why is there a preponderance of women named Destiny within the system, as there are a number of men named Jerome Kafar? And it speaks to, like, the overwhelming number of this name within the system speaks to the ways in which the system has been predetermined against these people. Another way that classification becomes an issue in the prison system is when trans prisoners, when male to female trans prisoners are incarcerated in male prisons, and vice versa when female to male prisoners are incarcerated in female prisons. And this is a piece by an artist named Michelle Handelman. It's a speculative fictional monologue. It's a series of monologues that were actually written by speaking with prisoners. It's set up for you to experience as if you were incarcerated and you're sharing a cell with a trans prisoner who speaks to you very intimately about the kinds of violences that they have experienced in the prison. What's that? What's that noise? I don't know. So once we've kind of figured out what something is or is not, or like fit something into a category that makes sense for an institution, that is the moment in which like extraction can happen. In the catalog, this is where Cameron Rowland's work fit in. And for those of you who know Cameron's work, he's often creating some situations in which he can mediate and sort of navigate institutional, like, objects made by prisoners outside of the system and get them into the museum. In the exhibition also, Keith Calhoun and Chandra McCormick are artists who are based in New Orleans, and they have been photographing Angola State Prison for the past 40 years. Angola State Prison is actually the Louisiana State Penitentiary, but it's called Angola because it is, it's actually on the same site that a former slave plantation was once stood. And the majority of the prisoners, or I'm sorry, the majority of the slaves on that plantation were from Angola. And from what I know, I believe that Angola was also a slave breeding plantation. So there was this way in which, like, it was a plantation that perpetuated itself and like made its own sort of economy. Chandra and Keith's photographs, and here's one called "Who's That Man on the Horse?" I know his name, but I don't know his name, but they call him Boss. It was made in like the early 1980s. Shows the ways that Angola continues to function as a enslaved labor, when prisoners are paid no more than 10 cents an hour for their work, which is often field work and overseen by white guards. So from extract, once the sort of value of the prisoner is extracted, I also can share the PDF if anybody wants to kind of get deeper into these ideas, because I realize I'm going pretty fast. But once you've taken all the sort of work out of the sort of bodies, then what have you left is to store the sort of extracted husk. And this is where Martin Wong became really important, and sort of Robert Morris and other artists who were thinking about how the ways in which that like punishment is conceptualized as a sort of refrain on the body, a hold on the body as a way to make a corrective on a soul level. So the storage became a corollary for thinking about the graveyard, which became another site where soulless bodies are kept. So I'm going to switch now to the figure section, and apologies for the density of this talk. So just to recap, this was a map of the prison industrial complex, and we moved from capture to display to evaluate to classify, extracting, and then finally storage as like how all, not only prisons, but also museums and all of these institutions are kind of functioning around whatever they are that they are collecting. You can think about an art object as kind of moving into the institution and then being classified and discursively described in the same ways, or a zoo animal or a library book, and that there's a sort of functionalities that institutions perform. So as we move on, just sort of the quick and dirty of the next section is that it is a map of the problem of mass incarceration. It's different from prison industrial complex. And we're going to move from racial profiling to arrest, to the courthouse, to the prison, and then the possibilities for release. So let's move forward. It's a big show, y'all. So there was this moment in which there was a sort of standoff between Glenn Ligon's Runaway series, which are portraits, I'm sorry, series of lithographs in which the artists used the rhetoric and grammatical structure and also the image types from 19th century, 18th century runaway slave posters. And those were displayed proximate to Dred Scott's wanted posters. And both shared this sort of same kind of format, but the juxtaposition here was to show that there's a way in which this sort of 18th century slave became, or fugitive became, the sort of criminalized youth of Dred Scott's East Harlem. So to tell you about Dred Scott's project, he is based in New York, and this was a project that he began in the sort of height of stop and frisk. He went into the Sugar Hill neighborhood of East Harlem and started meeting with young people, say like 14 to 18, about the things that were their greatest concern. And among those things was the ways in which stop and frisk had made them targets that were the number of times that they would get stopped had like increased exponentially. And oftentimes they were being stopped with crimes that are like supposed crimes that aren't actually reasons that you can stop anybody. So for instance, like probable cause for what is a sort of vague reason. Wearing baggy pants is another sort of reason. And so what Dred Scott and the kids did together was they decided that they wanted to have a sort of, to create a situation in which the neighborhood would rethink their relationship to their kids. So what they did was they arranged for a group of people to have passing encounters with 5 young people. These passing encounters lasted less than a minute. And then afterwards, the people who were doing the encountering sat down to speak with a police sketch artist. This sketch artist situation was a public performance, and what became really apparent was how little the people could remember from these passing encounters and how generic the sketch artist's drawings became. So here's on the right one of the resulting sketches, and what the kids wanted to do with these through a lot of discussion with the artist, was they decided to put them all over the neighborhood. So they plastered them on the sides of buildings, they put them up inside businesses, and having these images throughout the neighborhood became an opportunity for business owners to get into a conversation with these young people, and then for them to learn the kinds of scenarios that they were being subjected to, and ultimately for the neighborhood to begin to take more care and more stewardship for their young people, so that if they saw the sort of racial profiling and criminalization happen, they could intervene and step up for them. This work is related in the exhibition to work by Suzanne Lacey, who, with a group of collaborators in Oakland in the early 90s, also began to think through the problems of youth criminalization. So this is the racial profiling section. And from then we move into arrest. Now, I think this is one of the most intense parts of the exhibition, and it's also one of two parts of the exhibition when there's like a great deal of sort of vulnerable, where it becomes very apparent that this is a moment in which a person is in a sort of face-off with the potential of death on the other side. So in the arrest section, it became kind of a conversation, a three-part conversation. And the first part of that was with the police officer, and standing in that place is Chris Burden's oversized LAPD uniforms. So also from the early 90s, these are police uniforms that are standard in every way. They're baton issued. It has like the legit LAPD shield. Thanks, babe. And the only difference is that they're 9 feet tall. This is an exhibition this is an installation shot from the exhibition when the arms of the uniforms are kind of meant to be touching, and they encircle the view around you. So you get this sort of standoff between entrapment and sort of care. We actually chose to only have one in the show to have the sort of monumental authority figure. And that was juxtaposed with work like this performance by Autumn Night. Autumn actually performed this on the opening night of the CAM exhibition. And then there was a video documentation in the show. This is a hauntingly prescient video that she made in advance of Philandro Castile. Autumn, like me, is from Texas, and she was thinking about the ways in which open carry laws actually only applied to some people. And I think that Philandro Castile's death is proof of that. For those of you who don't know, Philandro Castile was a Black man who was killed by a police officer outside of Minneapolis. He had an open carry license. He had a gun on him. He made that gun known, and he was shot despite the being in legal ownership and possession of that gun, shot and killed. So Autumn is also thinking about, years before this happened, is also thinking about what are the actual possibilities and opportunities to be an open carrier of a firearm in Texas when you're Black. And this is a performance that she did in a gallery, and then she redid it at the CAM with razor blades. I will stop there. Also, as part of this section of the show, we had Sean Leonardo's The Eulogy. Leonardo is based in Brooklyn. This is a piece that I've been talking a long time. Okay, I'm like half done. So this is a piece that I'm talking a long time. Okay. So this is a piece that he did where he took this text from The Invisible Man. And if you're the sort of eulogy scene from that, and if you're familiar with that scene, it's a scene in which the nameless narrator is repeating the name of the friend who has been shot by the police over and over and over to drill it into the audience's head. And he's talking to an audience because he also knows that they're going to walk away from this funeral and they're going to forget about it and they're going to live on their own lives. And Sean saw the same sort of thing happening with rallying cries that would happen of around Trayvon Martin and then nothing. And then like same thing for Mike Brown, and the sort of all this public momentum would build into a frenzy and then the next person would die. And so he's appropriating this text and using it to think about the ways in which police death is mediated and generative of movement that also doesn't move so far. I'm gonna go faster. Carl Pope is based in Indianapolis. Y'all may know a much larger version from the Whitney Museum, but this is an earlier version of that piece that he did when he noticed that the sort of wave of deaths, police officer involved shootings of young Black men in the 1980s in Indianapolis, and how those police officers were often awarded, often promoted, and the young men would be forgotten as well. So this is a piece in which there's a trophy for each each officer who is getting promoted, that also has this function as a sort of memorial for the person who's died. So now we've moved into the courthouse, and this is a piece by Andrea Robbins and Max Becker. They also went across the country to every courthouse that has a 10 Commandments monument in front of it. Why? Because sometime in the 1950s, when the movie The 10 Commandments came out, this sort of Moose Lodge of Men's Association decided that every courthouse needed a 10 Commandments monument. And this actually was something that was mostly implemented in the South and heavily Christian states. And I think what Robbins and Becker are really interested in is the sort of ways in which the division between church and state is made manifest here, how these two things are really not divided in some places. So once we move from the courthouse, we get into, that's a terrible picture, we get into the prison itself. And there's sort of two trends that I noticed. One is in which the ways in which artists use materials and images to mark time. So this is a series called Untitled Snapshots from Dina Lawson. It's a very long line of Polaroid photographs, and what you see as you move through them is that it's always the same wall, and the woman's hairstyle changes. She's wearing very different clothes. The baby grows from being an infant to about 3 years old, and yet the man in the photograph always stays the same. So these are the, this is a photographic project that shows how visitation rooms as a sort of limbo state where the photograph can exit when the person cannot, and the photograph becomes a sort of way of marking time in the same way that marks become a way of marking time. So this is a piece by Cheryl Rowland called After the Wake Up. Cheryl was wrongfully incarcerated for 1 year in North Carolina. And it was right when he was supposed to start grad school. While he was in prison, it was his job to repaint the cell walls anytime anybody moved in or out. And what he realized as he was painting over these cells all the time was that no matter how long anybody had been in there, they would always leave their mark physically by writing into the walls. And so what he was doing over and over was writing, like painting over, but the wall itself became a sort of pamphlet of its own history and its own occupant. So this is a piece in which Cheryl provides you tools that are kind of like the makeshift tools that you would have in prison, and you score the museum wall directly. He also gives you a prompt often, and so that prompt changes every week, and with it the wall gets painted over. So by the end of the exhibition, you also have this like wall that has been embedded with its viewers. And so there's a sort of one-to-one that happens between the museum viewer and the prison occupier, the incarcerated person. So That's Sable Lily Smith's also in the show. So there were 3 ways to get out. I began to think about like, okay, there's all these ways to get in. Well, what are the ways that you get out? And so there's artists kind of showed me the way for each. So there's life in prison, meaning that you don't get out. And this is a project made by Sarah Ross, Damon Locks, and the incarcerated men at Statesville Prison, working together under the umbrella of Prison and Neighborhoods Art Projects. So they were thinking specifically about the problem of long-term incarceration, and especially the problem that that poses for people who are imprisoned later in life. So if you get a sentence of 20 years or more when you're like 40, that means you're not going to get out until like you're 60. And because of the qualities of life in prison, and the way in which it's actually a huge detriment to your health, there's a way in which long-term sentencing is a way to summon or to sentence somebody to the death penalty in states in which the death penalty has been abolished. So they're thinking about that project. Then there is a project by Terrence Even called Natural Life. Natural life is kind of a code word for life in prison that has been assigned to young people who were sentenced to life before they were 18. So in a sense, they'll spend their natural life in prison. This has also been decided to be unconstitutional by the United States. And now states across the country are each trying to figure out what they're trying to, like how to handle their youth population who have been in prison since their childhoods. In this project, Tirza worked with a group of young people that were sentenced to natural life, and they kind of told their stories through animation, but also through script writing. And then Tirza would take the scripts, and it's actually very easy to rent a prison in Michigan. There's a lot of decommissioned prisons, and those are often the sites of prisoner movies. So she recreated their stories using actors in other prisons. So in addition to life in prison, there's also execution. And there's a group of artists who are all making work about the death penalty, which means they're all making work about Texas specifically. And Texas, until the mid-90s, published all the final statements and all the final meal requests of their prisoners on death row online. So there's an online database that you can all go and read about. And this database has become an incredibly important archive for artists like Lucky Pierre, who've taken it and have over time recreated all 300 meals requested by Texas death row prisoners from the 70s through the 90s. And these sort of one-on-one performances where you are presented with a meal that has been requested by a death row inmate. You eat it in silence, photograph from above, and then this becomes an occasion to have afterwards to have a group conversation about the sort of death penalty with other people who have sat through this performance. I found it incredibly hard to eat my meal, which was just a cheeseburger. But there are really idiosyncratic things that have been requested by death row inmates that really like nail down, reinforce personhood. This kind of work is also indebted to somebody like Richard Kamler, who I would say is really one of the sort of grandfathers of this kind of work. He began making work about the death penalty in the 1970s, and this is him looking into that same archive and recreating those final meals in lead. So outside of the possibilities of life in prison and death in prison, there's also reentry into society. And yet, as the work of Laurie Jo Reynolds is showing, that is often coming with a lot of stigma. So these are a series of calling cards in the vein of Adrienne Piper project she did in the late 70s, where she would hand out calling cards saying like, hey, I know you didn't really mean to be racist when you said that. And if I call you out on it, I'm just like in a super double bind. So I'm just going to hand you this card instead. And so thinking about that and the kinds of obstacles that sex offenders in particular have to go through, she made these cards for those kind of tough encounters. And then I'm gonna leave this section with this card for legislators that Lori Jo hands out as well. She is an incredible advocate and artist who is one of the people who was successful in closing that supermax prison that I told you about at the beginning, and has now dedicated to her work for decriminalizing sex offense, which is a very complicated project. So we've now gone through mass incarceration, and now we've come to bridges. What I realized in the process of doing this show is that there are a lot of artists out there whose main project is not to be shown in museums, and whose work is often incredibly ephemeral and deeply based in artistic practice, and sort of antithetical to a show like, even like a show like this. Tufts, I'm really glad to have experienced this. The week before the exhibition closed at Tufts, we had the opportunity to have this really beautiful symposium where a lot of these artists who make work that's incredibly difficult to show came into the museum, and we talked about this kinds of work together. And so for me, bridges is the most important part of the show. These are artists that I find are trying to turn that wall sideways, trying to leverage possibilities to create situations in which incarcerated people have access to the outside world or legislature to change, or we'll just go through them. So Gregory Sale back in Arizona a couple years ago made an exhibition at ASU's museum, and because of the terms, he was also able to create scenarios in which prisoners could come into the museum to do things like paint walls, or which he could take museum visitors to Joe Arpaio's detention camp. So thinking of like using art as a specific way that can create a door to pass through. Photos from Solitary is another project that is involved in the TAMS Year 10 project that ended up closing that Supermax prison in Illinois. It actually started with this photographs. People started sending poems and these sort of requests called Photos from Solitary. So these forms that said if you could have any photograph for your cell wall, what would you want? And the incarcerated men there who were in solitary would write back and say, I would like these highly specific photographs. And then it began this dialogue with the men there that would ultimately leave with the closing down of the prison and the declaration that indefinite solitary is cruel and unusual punishment. So Nick Zuberla is somebody who's thinking about the medium of radio and has been really successful in creating communities together that help families of incarcerated people lobby. And this is not Base Collective. This is People's Paper Co-op, which is based in Philadelphia. They bring together the formerly incarcerated and put them in conversation with lawyers who help them expunge their records and then take that physical paper, blend it up and make new paper out of it. So that was a lot. I'm gonna stop there. And we'll go back to this.
Thank you, Risa.
Thanks.
I'm not sure you can hear the applause from all the many 58 participants in your audience. So everyone, it's time for Q&A. Who's going to be brave and ask the first question? When you're ready, just unmute your microphone and identify yourself, and Risa will call on you.
Hey, Risa, it's Jacob Leviton. I have a question for you.
Hey, Jake, what's going on?
Not too much, just enjoyed a fabulous talk. And yeah, it's my first Zoom experience. And what can I say? You let off extremely well, at least in terms of my experience platform. But I wanted to ask, and I'm so sorry, I forget the name of the artist's work where they were mobilizing Ralph Waldo Emerson's Invisible Man.
Not
And I guess
Ralph,
in general,
the other
Ralph Ellison.
Ralph Ellison. Yeah. And it's John Leonardo, sorry.
yeah. So in terms of Leonardo's work, I guess I'm fascinated by the way in which he's mining and mobilizing like a longer tradition of engaging with these really perfidious conditions. So I'm just wondering, is there sort of a broader sort of tapestry of which Invisible Man might be one text artists are mobilizing in terms of their respective and radical engagements with prison abolition. So I'm sorry, I'm sort of rambling, but yeah. So if Ellison's work is one, are there any others that you found in terms of your engagement with these artist practices?
Sure. There's Danny Giles is an artist also based here in Chicago. He's part of this sort of Chicago social practice with heart and bone, like, and muscle behind it. He was specifically thinking about, he's also part of the arrest section and part of this sort of triad. He kind of, his work fills in this other space between officer, citizen shot, and then witness. And he's specifically looking to crime and punishment a lot as another sort of text that I would say, together with my engagement with Foucault, who comes up and through like Tony Bennett and throughout, certainly for Mary Patton, that those are sort of the three texts. And I think that I think I called like Autumn Night's work like really prescient, but then also haunting. And when you go back to that original Ralph Ellison Invisible Man, it is haunting how this situation that it's being described in a sort of pre-civil rights moment is so often replicated in our contemporary moment, which then I think is the real bridge between Ellison and Leonardo about like what has and has not changed through a civil rights discourse.
Thank you so much.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Much was a very nice talk, and was very nice to see someone that make this kind of work in the curatorial practice also. And so I have a question that maybe is like also a little bit of statement. Mm. Is like related to a more general situation. So starting from the point that I find very interesting, the introducing part where you're saying which is the relation that artists have to have with the social context and the impact around. And then like moving to the work of Foucault that you quote, so discipline and punish, and the concept of panopticon that, of course, in the genealogy of Foucault, she approached all the fact of the jail, but also as a relation with the outside society. So the idea of panopticon as a general model that is related also to the outside society. So starting from this point, since we are facing this weird moment related to COVID, where for sure there is like problem relatives to the jails, so the prisoners as and the jails as a place that where epidemically the epidemic can spread more, And like, for example, in Italy, I'm from Italy, I'm in Italy right now. In Italy, there was like this big revolts last week in more than 30 jails. But also I think it's interesting how to see like the concept of panopticon with like the excuse of something like SARS-2 or COVID-19 or coronavirus, whatever we want to call, is going to expand much more and like is going to empower the vision of Foucault on this. Thanks, for example, we are starting to see this big process of control through drone, through like tracing people with GPS. And so like this giant idea of like a global home jailed that of course is due with public health and this, but at the same time there is like the fundamental freedom rights of everyone, and I don't think you can put in jail nobody. It's like, to me, like a jail is something that have to burn and that's it. But in any case, which is your, as a curator and as an artist and a person that face this kind of social issue, relates the idea of how we can, like as an artist and as a thinker and like person that make a thought around this kind of concept, can face like this every time more evident way of like the biopolitical structures come out, even in what we are used to think as a freedom society, but is not even like outside the jail.
Mm.
Sorry for the long
Great.
question.
No, thank you for the very good question. I want to talk also, this sounds like a really great moment to talk about the fact that we all need to be appealing to our, this is the kind of bind of your question, right? We all need to be appealing to our legislatures to let our incarcerated population out of jail. And I think that was recently successful in New Jersey, and it sounds like there's some things that are happening in Italy right now. And at the same time, the idea of like appealing to a situation that has historically like not been open to appeal for extenuating circumstances seems like an impossible sort of bind as well. I think one of the sort of things that your question pointed up was the difference between disciplinary power and biopolitical power. So like the panopticon sets up a scenario in which an individual is sort of zoned in on, has no idea in which they're being watched at any time, and then begins to watch themselves in relationship to that. So it instills a sort of disciplinary eye within a body. And then a biopolitical power, which is where Foucault sort of ends up at the end of his life as a different kind of power than disciplinary power, is the kind of power that I would almost say like COVID-19 is in itself a biopolitical power, because it really breaks bare like who has access to care, who is able to actually quarantine right now, who doesn't have to be working at the grocery store at Whole Foods and putting themselves sort of on the line, who will have access to care if they do or do not get sick. And the sort of creation of a remainder within society that fractions us off from each other as two different sorts of powers. I have also been wondering how COVID-19 is going to be used as like an enforcer
As
of
an
that.
excuse.
Yeah, like is COVID-19 going to be introduced into detainee populations, because that's a really simple way to do what the government wants to do with those people in an immediate kind of way. It becomes like a sort of outside biopolitical agents that relieves the government from responsibility. And I actually think that the prison population, the detained population are going to be the sort of, you know, they still are functioning in that like 1970s role of like test experimental subjects. So to get back to your question about like where do we as artists begin to make, or curators begin to work with. And this is why I chose to frame the show this way. Like, for me, it always comes back to the question about like, where is the ground that I'm standing on? And usually that ground, I find that my feet are so tied by certain situations, certain politics that I have to navigate around, that it's just really easy to start from where I'm standing and interrogate like my position within that spot as a place to start always. So that's why I came back to the site of the museum. And I also think that because of the ways in which art gets sort of free pass, I'm thinking about like the ways in which Gregory Sales was able to like leverage his position as an artist to kind of create this sort of corridor from which like prisoners could pass into the space of the museum, or which visitors can go into the space of the detention center. Like, that was also why it was really important for me to think about like what art can do. I also think that art can do a lot of stupid and useless things, and that there are lots of kind of projects that aren't in the show for those reasons. I think that there's, if you read the catalog deeper, there's a really kind of specific position that I take against a certain kind of photographic practice, especially if it's a photography of a prisoner. I make an argument that there's so many of these like photographs that are like pregnant prisoners, like prisoners with cancer, and like there are these appeals to humanity, and that what they end up doing is really just replicating the terms of surveillance, which kind of takes us back full circle to where we came. So I think that like figuring out what the ethic of your practice is really important, and then also realize that you're already always implicated. And so I try to leverage that implication by then turning it backwards on the space that's inviting me.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have 2 chats. Let's see. Yes, thank you, Carolyn Paz, who says, speaking about Foucault's ideas, the discourses about the pandemic are already a powerful disciplinary tool. Mark agrees.
Risa, this is Mark.
Hi, Mark.
At the beginning of your talk tonight, kind of in the introduction, you mentioned some ideas you had that I think you maybe wrote about in your catalog, ideas about the museum as a model for the prison, and or vice versa. Could you take an opportunity to expand on that?
It was the zoo as a model for the prison. Was it?
Oh, I thought the museum, no?
So Louis Laveau designed a menagerie for Louis XVI that is thought to be the model for Bentham's Panopticon.
Mm-hmm.
And then something else I talked about was the relationship of Tony Bennett's theory. So Tony Bennett's theory of exhibitionism is one that correlates the decline of punishment from the social landscape. So punishment ceases to be a spectacle at the same time that the museum, specifically the World's Fair, Crystal Palace, like also a sort of host of exhibitionary platforms arise to take over the space of like public diversions / spectacle.
Okay.
And it is in those spaces that the bodies of foreign people are displayed as a way to kind of consolidate a hegemony in the viewer. But architecturally, the Panopticon and the zoo have a relationship to each other. And we can probably show you.
Oh, are we waiting for a question?
Yes, we are.
Oh, okay. I mean, this is a little minor point to pick up on, but I'm really sort of super curious. You said something earlier about people being released from prison, and which as a concept, I agree with it, but you know, there are people that, from a long history of working with people in that situation, there are some people that I think it's not safe to let them out in the world again, or people like Harvey Weinstein, for example, who I think, I don't care if he dies in prison. And I'm sort of curious about that dilemma that comes up when you know that prisons are really shitty places for anyone to be in at any time. But there are people that there is that sort of frisson of saying, thank goodness you finally understood what it is like to be powerless, for example, as a woman.
So I think Harvey Weinstein is like a really great example of something, and that is who escapes the terms of criminality.
Yeah.
In that, like, it took an entire social movement, like Me Too, for the crimes that a man who has been committing for decades to even be recognized as criminal. So this became a different kind of conversation about like how the idea of criminal is constructed, and if a man like Harvey Weinstein can escape sort of responsibility for such a long time, who are being asked to be responsible for crimes that aren't crimes in the same sort of way. So for instance, my family member is serving 20 years in prison for being asleep in a car while somebody else committed a crime. The officers who were a part of his sentence, part of the problem is that he pled guilty, wanting to be responsible, and then they introduced a whole bunch of information that had nothing to do with him that made him look more guilty than he was, despite an officer getting on saying, we know this man has nothing to do with this crime and was asleep and didn't know anything was happening. And because there's laws in Texas that say they're kind of laws of community, so they're kind of gang laws that are set up to say like you're guilty by association. So a man who's asleep in a car can be arrested for 20 years without having to do anything, and yet Harvey Weinstein can be free to rape for decades. So part of the argument has to do with like how laws and guilt and ideas of what is a crime are constructed to begin with. Which, I mean, I can go on. If you saw my Monarch show, I can really go on about the settler state here, and that, getting back to the institution, what we're talking about is how settler colonialism establishes institutions to protect itself.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Do we have other questions from students or others on?
I just wanted to ask Risa, what's the best way that we could read your catalog right now?
So technically the catalog is sold out. It is, you can find, it was distributed by DAP, so sometimes you can go into like Rando Museum and get a copy off the shelf, but it's not available on Amazon anymore. You can try to get a copy from the publisher, and I would love it if you could get a physical copy. And if you can't get a physical copy, I'm also happy to share a PDF, which I just think you should share widely because it should be free.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'll send that to you after we get off the phone.
Okay, awesome.
You can even upload a file via the chat if you want, or you can just send it to Allison and she can distribute it, to our students if you like.
Cool.
Okay, I'll ask maybe one last question, unless anybody else has one, and that has to do with the group of artists you described whose work isn't really intended for museum and gallery venues. And could you just speak a little bit more about how you negotiated that? I mean, my sense is, you know, what they're up to is not institutional critique per se, not trying to get into the museum to sort of break it down or change it, but really just, you know, a different mode of address, different idea of audience, different sense of what, you know, how to reach and engage with people. So how did you negotiate that compromise?
Well, what's really interesting about those artists is that they also recognize that the museum is a benefit to them, and that maybe it's not their ultimate goal, but that they can like leverage the museum to read a wider audience for their cause. So it's like a kind of museum as mass media tool, museum as marketing tool, and like consciously knowing that in advance. And I wouldn't say, I mean, exploiting is a little hard word, but definitely like they have a different sort of agenda for the museum than the museum has for them. I'll also say the difference between the Contemporary Arts Museum and Tufts is that the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston was really like not set up to support this kind of practice. And so what was great about the show traveling to Tufts was that Tufts really was, and could do things like a symposium or multi-day workshops with artists along these lines, and putting them, and I think it's just kind of like how universities have different kinds of resources for different kinds of projects than like kind of more traditional museums that are less familiar or like less comfortable with dealing with things outside of like objecthood. So I think that what they're doing is also switching a sort of standard rules of engagement for how we think museum artists can interact with museums by kind of turning the museum into a bullhorn as the primary goal, rather than waiting for a museum to like kind of offer you anything and taking it or yeah. Did that answer your question, Mark?
It sure did. Risa, thank you so much. I really appreciate your launching the first of our online talks. Thanks everybody for participating, and we'll see you again for our next talk